What's up, my dudes? Boys, I couldn't even tell you the last time I made an MX Simulator guide video. Damn, dog. This is cool. This is fun. Been a really long time. I told you boys I was wanting to get back into doing some old school style videos here. So today, we have a jumping into whoops guide video, which is not to be confused with jumping through whoops. Two completely different things, okay? I don't mean like, you jump through the whoops instead of skim them. I mean, these particular whoop sections where there's some sort of a jump before it that allows you to potentially actually jump and land into the whoop section. This can be one of the most complex, difficult obstacles in this game. It's definitely one of those things where, like, a beginner, even an amateur, is going to have a really hard time actually jumping into a whoop section without just completely wadding their brains out in a game like MX Simulator, right? So I thought it was worthy, kind of a cool little specific, different kind of a tutorial on a certain element of this game. So we're here on this 2021 Daytona track. This track was actually pretty decent right here. This was one of the RF tracks over these past few years that I thought was actually pretty decent. And this was just one of those really separating lines on the track right here where, if you wanted to attempt to try to jump into the whoops, it was a potential possibility. And is it really going to make you all that much faster on this track? I mean, it's a game of inches, You think about in a section like this, instead of letting off right here, you see how there's this little, just not even really a single jump, just a little bitty, just enough to raise you up over into the whoop section, right? So you basically have two options here. You can either, hold it wide open and just hit that first little jump right there into the whoops wide open and go through the whoops, or you can kind of go up to it, let off of the gas right here, or get on the brakes, right, and keep yourself from popping up off the ground so then that you would stay on the ground and just hit this whoop section like a normal whoop section, but with having to slow yourself down there before you even hit the whoop section, that's obviously going to, slow you down a little bit. But it's all about, like, you've got to be able to jump into the whoops without losing all of your momentum. That's one of the biggest elements to jumping into a whoop section, right? You got to be able to jump into it, but then still skim over the whoops or jump through the whoops like you would have anyways. But there's something that makes that so difficult in this game, trying to hit a whoop section when you're already in the air. It's one thing when you're on the ground and you kind of hit that first starter whoop and it gets you set up on the top of them, and that's one thing. But when you're literally leaving the ground and landing in the whoops, it pretty much multiplies the difficulty of it like tenfold, as you can see right there. That can happen to you very easily on a whoop section like this when you're jumping into it like that, right? So one of the biggest things to this whole jumping in a whoop section, this is what you call definitely a like advanced technique in this game, for sure, without a doubt, 100%. It's an advanced technique, you know what I mean? And I think one of the biggest critical things is you have got to have your rider mass distribution high enough, okay? That's going to be a setting within the setup of the bike there. And this is going to allow you to maneuver more on that bike to where you can it creates such a upsetting feeling to the bike whenever you jump and you land in a whoop section. That's just very upsetting to the bike to begin with, right? So, like, for instance, if I was in here on stock, I think it's like 0.33 rider mass distribution, I simply could not maneuver that bike enough to control it once I jumped into the whoop section, and then it starts trying to ricochet off of those whoops. You literally can't control it if you don't have your rider mass distribution high enough. But that's something that you work up over time the faster you get in this game. So this really is more of a pro level technique in this game. You know what I mean? So if you're a beginner, I'm not saying go in there and raise your rider mass distribution to maximum, because you're not ready for that amount of movement in the game yet. Even as an amateur, I wouldn't recommend going in here and raising your rider mass distribution to maximum or anything like that, because you're not even to that level in the game yet to where you can control the bike with that high of a rider mass distribution to begin with. But it's something that is going to massively help you on specific obstacles like this right here. And it'll also help you on like double dragon's backs, like jumping from one dragon's back to another. Anything that you got to kind of jump and ricochet off of a certain whoop of any kind. It really helps you with that maneuverability of the bike and doesn't make it feel so stiff, right? So that's number one thing. It's going to be tough to jump into a whoop section if you don't have your rider mass distribution high enough in this game, period. So, you know, if you're finding yourself jumping into this whoop section like on this track right here and you're instantly flipping over every single time, that could be part of the problem, because you don't even have enough movement. You don't have the bike loose enough. And even with those like vertical, horizontal, spring, whatever the hell those settings are under your gearing, right? I'm not talking about any of your actual suspension, but everything under your gearing, like the rider mass distribution, the vertical, horizontal type shit, that's what really gives you more movement out of the bike, right? And even your stability to a certain extent is going to affect that somewhat, right? But so that's kind of a, you know, you'd have to have your bike set up in a certain way to, no matter how fast you are, no matter what your technique is, no matter how good you are in this game, it's going to be very difficult to get through this sort of an obstacle like I'm talking about at that speed level. It's going to be very hard to get through that if you don't have more of a pro level, looser setup on the bike. So, you know, that's just number one. That has to be said. Now, let's get a little more into that technique of it right here. And again, you know, any opinion I have with any kind of guide tutorial video in this game, you can take it or leave it. You know, you don't have to listen to what I'm saying. If you think you're all badass in this game, good on you, dog. Go do your own thing. I'm just giving my opinion on, you know, how I go through it, what I think would help some of you guys going through it and stuff like that. So, you can see right here, see how I jumped basically into that second whoop, right? Jumped clear over the starter whoop and over the next whoop and landed right down in there on that. That's not how I would start to jump into a whoop section. Like if I was somebody trying to jump into this whoop section, like just from starting, what I would do here is I would start by just slowly jumping into it. You know what I mean? Like try to jump and hit like right on that starter whoop instead of jumping 3 or 4 whoops into it. And then you'll kind of start to get that feeling of jumping and landing into a whoop section and then being able to keep the bike under control by going through the rest of the whoop section, right? That's with a lot of things on MX Sim, man. And whoops are one of the best examples of this. You gotta start slow. You gotta like work your way up, you know what I mean? And that's a very important thing, because if you don't get that feeling of working your way up through it, it's gonna be very hard to go from 0 to 100 really quick, you know what I mean? Whole squat on that really shit. It's gonna be really hard to do that. And that's kind of part of that learning process of this game. But like in a rhythm like this right here, I mean, this is something where, you know, an amateur or a beginner, they're just going to let off right here on this single, and they're just going to, then they would just hit this like a normal whoop section. But the faster and the faster you get, the more pro levels speed you get, you can start doing these special little things like this, like jumping into a whoop section, just those little micro, you know, 5% faster type things you can do on the track, but it ramps up the potential risk, the potential of crashing also ramps up with that potential of being 5% faster by hitting it that way. So you really pretty much got to be pro level speed before you start really jumping into these whoops. You can see right there I jumped Let's see how many I actually jumped in there. So, you know, it's a workup process, right? You can just jump further and further, which means you can carry more speed before. So right here, I jumped over the starter whoop, the whoop after that, and smacked basically right on the fourth one right there. So that's getting pretty hardcore for this kind of an area. I definitely wouldn't recommend jumping any more than like 4 whoops in, or it's just gonna explode the suspension when you land. You know, that's kind of part of it right there. But another thing is, anytime you're jumping into a whoop section, obviously you're trying to hit that jump before the whoop section, stay as low to the ground as you possibly can. Whether that's like trying to kind of pre-lean, you know what I mean? Where you're kind of leaning back right here and then leaning forward to kind of keep yourself as low to the ground as you possibly can. That's going to help you anytime you jump through a whoop section. If you can scrub that jump before, but then that'll kind of, you got to be careful doing that, because then it'll get you kind of off-centered. You won't be as straight on the bike when you land on that whoop section. That's a really important. You got to be straight when you land. With any kind of simulator, it's very important in keeping that bike as straight as possible on any kind of whoop section, regardless if you're jumping into it, just skimming it, whatever the hell you're doing. You know, the straighter you can keep it, the better off you're going to be through it. You know what I mean? So that's a big element right there. But like jumping in, you know, it's just, you got to start small, you know, just double into the whoop section. And then get yourself where you can triple into it. And then get yourself where you can do kind of like I was doing there and jumping all the way to the fourth whoop. You know, you just slowly work yourself up, go a little bit faster, a little bit faster. And when you jump into a whoop section, this is a big thing technique-wise right here. When you first land, the bike is going to try to flip over. You know, it's going to try to upset itself. So you have to be pretty extreme with your leaning when you first land, like forward or backwards, to control that shit, right? That's a really important aspect of it. When you first land, you got to be pretty heavy on your leaning. You got to be pretty quick on your, you know, on your controls, with having a pretty loose setup to the point where you can really maneuver that bike properly to then get it back to that steady gliding point over the whoops after that initial land. You know, that initial land is where you really got to be careful, because that's where it's going to kill you. Right? That initial landing, because once you get straightened out, once you land and get straightened out, it's really just like hitting any other whoop section at that point, right? Whether or not you're jumping through the rest of them, or skimming the rest of them, or whatever the case may be, right? But it's all about that initial landing. That's where you got to be the most careful. You see how it tried to step out on me right there, right when I landed? See how that ass end kind of landed first on that one and then tried to kick out on me? But again, if you have your rider mass distribution high enough, you got your settings down, you can keep that bike under control. You know, sometimes you got to kind of wrangle that bull a little bit, you know what I mean? You got to ride that bull a little bit. It's going to buck and, you know what I mean? It's going to buck. Nuck if you buck. It's going to do a little bit, you know what I mean? So, but typically through a whoop section, I try to tell you boys, like, the best thing you can do is not steer and not turn and don't overcorrect. Let the bike work underneath you. That's true on a typical whoop section. But when you're specifically trying to jump into a whoop section, that's not necessarily the case, because you have to get it back under control before you can stop moving, you know? When you jump into a whoop section, you're gonna have to lean. You're gonna have to turn. You're gonna have to do some shit to keep that bike under control when you jump into whoops at that high of a speed like that, right? So that's kind of an element to it. You know, typically going through a whoop section, you don't want to move very much. You want to try to keep it as straight as you can. Don't move very much. But on this kind of instance, you want to jump into it, and you're going to have to basically, you know, like with every action, there's a equal and whatever the hell reaction. So if you're going to jump into a whoop section like this, you're going to have a reaction out of the bike, and you're going to have to do an equal opposite reaction to keep it under control. Do you know what I mean? Do you understand what I'm saying there? And as far as like what you're looking for when you jump through a whoop section like this, it's not like I'm sitting there thinking in my head when I come around the corner like, oh, I'm going to jump right into that third whoop, or oh, I'm going to jump right into that fourth whoop, or I'm going to land right on top of that second or third one. You can't really guesstimate it that much, you know? It's kind of a flip of a coin, okay? Like when you come around this corner, you hit this triple right here, it sets you up, and then you're getting a bunch of speed right here. Like every time you come around here, you're probably going to jump into these whoops a little bit of a different way. And that's a big part to this guide here. You've got to know, like, and once you get about right here, you know, you're hitting it about as fast as you can when you get up to that level, right? You're going to be hitting it about as fast as you can. But once you get about right here, you're going to realize whether or not you're going to jump kind of down in a whoop or kind of land on top of a whoop. But you're not going to know that way the hell back here in the corner. Do you understand what I'm saying? And that's where you got to be quick on the ball with your reaction of it, because obviously you're going to react differently landing on top of a whoop versus landing down in a whoop. If you land down in a whoop, it's kind of just like landing on a jump, right? Landing down in a jump. But if you land like on top of a whoop, you're going to have to really lean quite a bit to take that initial reaction and then start skimming after that, right? But you got to be very quick on your toes to realize whether or not you're going to land down in a whoop or land on top of a whoop, and you're just simply not going to know that till you get right about here, you know? Then once you kind of figure out what you're doing, then you can lean and make adjustments at that point, right? But sometimes you're going to have to do quite a bit of leaning and maneuvering on the bike to keep it under control. And I mean, sometimes you got to lean that thumbstick maximum forward, maximum backwards, and forward again while you're steering to keep it under control when you hit something like that. I'm not talking about make a micro movement. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes you got to make a big movement right there to keep that bike under control when you hit a section like that. That's a very big deal to this. It's not like just hitting a whoop section normally, right? But this is going to be a big separator, especially on some of those old school tracks where, you know, you can hit some jump into a whoop section. You're going to be able to smoke some kids if you can learn this kind of obstacle right here. You don't see it too much nowadays, especially with a lot of the easier RF tracks. A lot of times you just can't really jump into a whoop section, but if you could, it's not even faster anyways, that sort of thing. But I feel like on this track right here, it actually, if you can keep enough speed once you jump into them, it's actually faster because you don't have to slow down beforehand on that little single before to just glide over them and never come off the ground. You know, it's certainly faster to jump into these whoops if you can control the bike when you do that. But again, the faster and faster you can get in this game and these more advanced techniques you get, it also ramps up the potential of crashing and the potential danger of it, you know. It's way more simple to not jump into these whoops, you know, and you've always got to weigh out that risk of like, is it really that much faster to jump in, or would it be faster to get on the brakes and then just skim them and stay on the ground, right? There's always kind of a balancing act there, but I feel like just specifically with how this small single is before this whoop section, it really opens up that door to actually potentially make a faster option by jumping in. No matter if you just double into the whoops, triple into the whoops, quad into the whoops, whatever it is you're doing. But again, the goal is not to be jumping up and down on the whoops. You know, that's never your goal through a whoop section. You're trying to stay as low as you can, stay on the ground, keep your fucking wheels on the ground as much as you can, and that's going to drive you forwards, you know. Even when you jump into a whoop section, all you're really doing is jumping in and then trying to start skimming through them, you know, trying to treat it like a normal whoop section once after you jump into it. But the only reason you're jumping into it is because you don't want to have to get on your brakes and slow down before the whoop section. Do you see what I'm saying? But it's not like you're trying to jump let me go happy-go-lucky, jump up to the moon on every one of these whoops right here. You're still using your same original whoop technique after you make that initial landing. You just have to do a little bit more leaning, you know, at that initial landing point because it's so harsh on the bike. It's so upsetting to the bike when you do that in this game. But boy, it can be rewarding when you get to that point where you can actually start hitting stuff like that. So yeah, that's about the gist of it here. It's just one of those things, just like anything in this game. The more you do it, the more you practice it, the more everything becomes easier. Everything. You know, there was a time I would have thought this was literally impossible to do a quad into these whoops and survive it, you know. There's definitely a long time through my playing this game I would have thought, there's no way in hell you can quad into those whoops and then skim the rest of them. But the more you play the game, the more you advance that movement, that setup, that everything, you know, it all just works up together. And before you know it, you can start hitting some really cool shit like this and hit it in a specific way like that, you know. Now, sometimes you'll get a lot bigger of a initial potential jump into a whoop section. This one's pretty small right here. Like I'm saying, this single before the whoops is pretty small. So you can stay low to the ground regardless. You see that right there, how I'm barely getting off of the ground? Obviously, another big element to this, don't drop your front end right down into these whoops. I mean, that kind of goes without saying. You know, when you jump into them, you're going to have to be a little more leaning back on the bike. And I don't mean super lean back. I mean, you got to be just right on that leaning back, right? And then when you have that initial landing reaction, the best possible scenario really is to land like this right here, where you bounce right on the top, but then your front hits right on that next whoop, and then you just start gliding them like they're any other whoop section, right? That's technically the best way to hit this, the fastest way to hit this, right? And you don't want to land with your front wheel first, but you want to land kind of a little bit wheel high, front wheel high, right on top of one of the whoops. You see how I'm like landing right on that one, right? Not enough to flip me over instantly, but then the very next whoop, my front wheel is perfectly set up to bounce off that, and then that's what then sets you up to then start just hitting your front wheel on every whoop after that, right? So that's kind of part of it there. But what I was saying before is, you know, let's just say this jump was a lot bigger. Like, let me just kind of show you here, for instance. Let's say, you know, this very easily could have been like, hold on a second here. Okay, had to remember what I was doing there for a second. But like, for instance, right here, right, let's see what we got here. There we go. Set from terrain. Okay, Spency Boy's relearning this shit again. Let's say that, you know, that initial little single's about that big. Let's say you had something more like this right here. Right? Let me try to linear paint this shit real quick. Try to smooth this out just a little, just to give you a bit of an example here. All right, let's say it was a little more like that right there. You can see, right? And I'm not actually going to hit it here because this is a playback race, right? But let's say that the face of that was that big into that whoop section. That would make it like 10 times more gnarly, right? But what you would do in that case is sometimes the jump before is just too big to where it's not worth jumping in. Do you know what I mean? It creates too much of a risk jumping in that way, and it becomes where you've got too much verticality into the whoop section to where you're just not going to be able to skim them. You're not going to be able to really get through them, you know. Sometimes you get the first jump phase too big where it's worth just getting on your brakes and rolling that and then going into the whoop section, right? But that's not how I would say this original jump was here. It's definitely worth jumping in these on the original one. But if you do have a little bit bigger of an initial jump, maybe not this big, but a little bit bigger, like, let me kind of show you right here. Let's see. Yeah. Set from terrain, brother. If you had it more like that, right? Let's paint this on right quick, ski. Right? Okay. Back this up just a little. Right? If it was a little more like that, so bigger than the original, but not as big as what it just was, it may still be worth jumping in, but when it gets a little bigger like that, it's like you really have to land in between a whoop, right? In between the transition of a whoop. The bigger and the bigger that initial jump gets, the more and the more you're going to have to land down in a whoop because you have to have some kind of landing there, right? But this original single right here that wasn't this big, you can get away with landing kind of on top of one, right? And you can skim. But that's something you got to kind of know from riding on a bunch of tracks in this game, whether or not that initial jump into the whoops is big enough to where you need to land down in a whoop, or if it's small enough to where you can land on top of a whoop. It's just one of those things you got to kind of know. It's all about the pitch of that initial jump and kind of how much it's going to pitch the bike up and the face of it and everything. All that shit makes a difference, right? But just from experience, the bigger and the bigger you get that initial jump, the more you're going to have to actually think about landing down in one, which is almost impossible at that speed. It can be very difficult to time that out to where you hit this like, third gear, fourth gear wide open on a 450 and actually think about landing right down in one. But if the whoops are separated enough, you can really do that a lot easier, but nonetheless, but yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things like, you got to really, really have that keen eye of being able to, especially if you're playing in first person, being able to see right where that front wheel is landing. That's a very big thing. And kind of in your front fender in relation to right where that tire is landing, you got to know right where that shit is so you can make the proper adjustments to the bike when you're going through a whoop section like that, right? That's a really big tip right there. I mean, I realistically don't know how you would jump into a whoop section like this in third person because you're not even going to be able to see what the fuck you're doing. You know what I mean? You're not really going to be able to see where that front wheel is landing. But in first person, you get a lot closer of a view at right where that front wheel is. That makes all the difference in the world when you're going through a whoop section in this game. Jumping in or skimming or anything. So anyways, that's just a little bit of my knowledge on jumping through a whoop section. Hope it helps you guys out. Appreciate you guys watching all the videos. I do have a playlist on my front page of my channel that is all of the other MX Simulator guides and tutorial videos that I've made in the past. I'll try to put a link in that in the comments or description or whatever this video if you want to go take a look at that. But yeah, hope this helped you boys out a little bit. It's a big setup. Typically I talk about how your setup's not that big of a deal with most obstacles in this game. But specifically when you're jumping through a whoop section, it's like crucial to have your rider mass distribution high enough. You got to have enough movement or you literally can't move the bike enough to keep it under control when you land in a whoop section. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's crucial. Crucial. But again, you got to be at a pretty high level before you even get the bike that loose to begin with. So that's a big aspect to it. But nonetheless, man, appreciate you guys watching all the videos. Later, dudes.